Those are the exceptions to the employment at will doctrine. But before I go forward and talk about some other employment laws, let me talk about these exceptions in the context of the problems that we discussed earlier. The first problem had Jane, the employee, working with Jerry, her boss, and her husband, Frank, the Cowboys fan. Jane and Jerry go to the annual Christmas party where Frank is an obnoxious Cowboy fan cheering wildly as the Cowboys beat the Redskins. Jerry, angry at Frank, decides to fire Jane the next day without cause other than the fact she doesn't like her husband. Jane sues for wrongful termination. Who wins and why? In this case, and it seems harsh, Frank probably wins because Jane is an at-will employee and she had no exception that applied to her in this case. The second case is Robert, the owner of the Red Hatter, a popular restaurant named after his wife Rose. Rose and Robert recently divorced, and after a difficult meeting with the divorce lawyers, Robert comes to work, sees Janice, who has red hair like Rose, reminds her of Rose, and decides to fire Janice in a pique. Janice sues for wrongful termination. Who wins? Again, Robert wins. The employee, Janice is an employee at will, and none of the exceptions apply to her. The next case was Bob the cashier, who had jury duty. His boss, Frank, told Bob, you cannot follow your jury duty or take your jury duty and miss work. Bob goes ahead, does jury duty, misses work, returns to work. Frank fires him, claiming that he's an employee at will. In this case, Bob likely wins because jury duty is one example of public policy that applies. The next case is Randy. Randy received and accepted a verbal agreement to an employment offer from Acme Tile Company to be a regional sales manager. The offer outlined a detailed compensation scheme consisting of annual salary, quarterly commissions, benefits, and vacation. His territory was well described, time of work, location was all there. Randy was also told to move closer to the Acme headquarters. He did that. He sold his house, moved closer, quit his previous job, and when he showed up for work, he was told that they were going in a different direction, they weren't going to hire him. Randy sues for wrongful termination. Who wins? In this case, probably Randy under the implied contract or implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, because all of the elements were present. First, Randy got a bad deal. Second, Randy took steps to perform his end of the contract. He quit his job, he moved closer to sold his house and moved closer to the employer. All of these constitute consideration. And secondly, the terms and conditions in the verbal agreement were sufficiently described in terms of pay, scope of work, duration, that the court could construct a contract out of that. So in this case, my bet, Randy wins based on implied contract. The last case, same facts, only when Randy comes to work, he meets Johnny. Johnny's his immediate supervisor who wanted to hire his brother-in-law for Randy's job. Mad at Randy, Johnny changes the terms and conditions of work. He says no sales commissions for first-year guys. He says that your territory is doubled, and if you don't like it, quit. Randy does quit, sues for wrongful termination. Who wins? It's a close call, but probably Randy wins this case under the constructive discharge theory. Here is why. Number one, Randy quit. He wasn't fired. Number two, and this is the big question, is were the conditions that were forced on Randy, no commissions, larger territory, and a hostile boss, sufficient so that no reasonable employee could be expected to work under those conditions? Arguably, I think it's probably the case that Randy would win this case under constructive discharge, but it's a close call and would come down to what the judge or the jury thought of, were these conditions so unreasonable that Randy could no longer work there. So those are the four common law exceptions to the employment at will doctrine. What I'd like to talk about next are a couple of other areas of law that come up frequently in this day and age. First is tort liabilities. Now, tort is a legal term for personal injury. As this is an employment law course, I normally don't talk a lot about torts, but there are a couple that come up in the workplace situation, so I want to touch on them. The first is emotional distress. Emotional distress occurs in a workplace when there's an intentional and outrageous act by the employer that injures the employee. The second tort liability is defamation, where an employer makes a false and defamatory statement about the employee that is communicated to a third party without the employee's consent. And lastly, it causes harm to the employee. The next tort is invasion of privacy. Now, there's a lot of examples of how the employer can invade the employee's privacy that we'll talk about in that chapter. So just note that an invasion of privacy is a tort violation that an employer can be sued for. So the next law I'd like to talk about is military leave, because it's coming up a lot now with soldiers coming home. Employee soldiers returning from duty and have an honorable discharge are protected from discrimination for their service if the following conditions occur. Number one, must have an honorable discharge. Number two, the employee must have provided the employer with notice that he intends to return to his job. Third, I should say, the employee must not have been gone for more than 5 years. And lastly, the employee can return to a similar position, not the exact same position. So that's the tort law and military leave. What I'd like to do now is just do a quick review of employment at will and its exceptions. First of all, most employees in the United States, up to 70% of them, work under employment at will. Secondly, employment at will only applies when the following are not present. Number one is an employment contract between an individual employee and his employer. That can be verbal or written. The second exception is when a group of employees, through a union, bargain on the terms and conditions of employment. That's called a collective bargaining agreement. The third exception occurs for government workers. They are civil servants, and they operate under the Civil Service Act, which define the terms and condition of employment. Next slide. The common law exceptions to employment at will are, number one, public policy, number two, implied contract, number three, implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, which is very similar to implied contract, and finally, constructive discharge. So that's a quick overview of employment at will, the foundational element, the foundational law in American employment law, and we will be discussing statutory exceptions for the rest of this course.